We're meeting here today to take unprecedented actions to respond to an unprecedented emergency. The truth is, these are extraordinary times. Ceann Comhairle, today we're asking the Oireachtas to pass emergency legislation to respond to the COVID-19 emergency. Emergency actions that will mitigate the impact of the virus and enable us to continue to provide public services. Desperate times do not call for desperate measures. Rather, they call for composure and for radical responses that will provide hope and bring maximum benefit to those who need them most. This legislation is designed to do exactly that.
In March 2020, Ireland, like many other countries around the world, introduced emergency measures to save lives and to stop the spread of COVID-19. Despite the devastation caused by the virus, we've seen immense solidarity across the globe. From the dedication of frontline workers to acts of compassion within our communities, human resilience has been to the fore. In some of the poorest countries in the world, such as Somalia, with barely functioning health systems, people have shown a determination to survive and to help one another. But the pandemic has also laid bare the global drift towards authoritarian leadership and has been a major accelerant of injustice, especially in fragile or undemocratic states. The reality is that powerful forces, including repressive governments and some private companies, have exploited the health crisis to further their own agendas at the expense of human rights. When major crises hit, like the pandemic, governments are required to act to save lives and to protect public health. Restrictions on some human rights can be justified when they are strictly necessary, are temporary in duration, and don't disproportionately affect specific groups. In order to stop the spread of the virus, many governments placed limits on freedom of movement throughout their countries. However, some governments may also be using the pandemic as a smokescreen for oppression. In Zimbabwe, for example, human rights activists have accused the government of exploiting the health crisis to silence critics and attack opposition supporters. In Honduras, the government suspended the right to freedom of expression. Such repressive actions have a major impact on the ability of journalists and human rights defenders to hold governments to account and to challenge corruption and human rights abuse.
The hostile governments will always use whatever excuse they can find to target human rights defenders.
Mary Lawlor is the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Human Rights Defenders. Her job is to examine the challenges facing human rights defenders globally and to help ensure their protection.
So what we have seen in the COVID-19 pandemic is that those hostile governments are targeting anyone who reports, for example, in the case of journalists, on the impact of COVID. So, for example, countries like China, El Salvador, Turkey, Egypt, Iran, Belarus and Vietnam have all put people under house arrest or harassed them or imprisoned them for their work documenting the impact of COVID in the country.
And so, Mary, what we're seeing isn't necessarily something new. Rather, the pandemic is exacerbating a pre-existing trend of attacks against human rights and environmental defenders. Is that right?
Well, that trend has been sort of on the go for at least, I would say, half a dozen years. And we have seen where human rights defenders and civil society activists are being increasingly targeted by governments. And the kind of patterns that we've seen are an increase in killings of human rights defenders. You know, it might start with intimidation and then a violent attack and then a killing of a human rights defender.
It's important to remember that the pandemic doesn't exist in a vacuum. Instead, it interacts with well-established structures of injustice. And with this in mind, we can begin to understand how certain measures used to tackle the virus, like surveillance technology, can pose major risks to human rights. When used with appropriate safeguards, digital surveillance may be a useful tool to help combat the spread of the virus. However, there are genuine concerns about the misuse of surveillance technology, especially in countries with poor human rights records. In Guatemala, for example, the government introduced a COVID-19 alert app called Alerta Guate. Human rights groups investigated the use of the app, and because of the concerns raised, the app was removed in April 2020. While the app communicated information about the pandemic, it collected users' exact locations, even when the app was closed. But it also allowed for data to be held for up to 10 years, far beyond the likely duration of the pandemic. Guatemala is a country with high levels of oppression against human rights and environmental defenders. In fact, it's not unusual for human rights defenders in Guatemala to be arrested under false accusations of terrorism offences. So when the president of Guatemala said he hoped the app could evolve to cover security issues, this raised major concerns about how it could be used to target human rights defenders. To better understand the negative implications of mass surveillance, it's useful to look at the experience of Palestinians living under Israel's occupation. Having already seized large amounts of Palestinian land in 1948, Israel further occupied Palestinian territory in 1967, annexing East Jerusalem and imposing a military occupation over the West Bank and Gaza. Since then, Israel has implemented a surveillance and population control regime that violates the basic human rights of Palestinians.
In the initial conversations about how to manage COVID-19, a lot of countries were talking about developing technologies to monitor the movement of COVID-19 patients and to think about how do you monitor this movement. Well, Israel didn't really need to develop anything.
Ria Al-Sana works for Who Profits, an independent research centre dedicated to exposing the commercial involvement of Israeli and international corporations in Israel's occupation of Palestinian and Syrian land.
Now we're living in a pandemic and everybody's kind of shocked by the reality of not being able to travel and to move and for our movement being controlled. But in essence, that's a reality to a degree that Palestinians have been living through since the initial occupation of Palestine. It's a reality that generations of people have grown up with. And so there's this direct military oppression and existence that exists on the ground. And then you have the surveillance technology that come as an accompanying element to this reality that exists. So you have people's calls being intercepted, you have people's engagement on the internet being intercepted and controlled. And so it affects every element of your existence as a Palestinian.
Andrea, I suppose, given Israel's extensive experience using surveillance against Palestinians, it's no wonder then that the country has become a global leader in the exportation of surveillance technology around the world. And I see reports that the Israeli military are currently trying to map the security needs of countries around the world in the context of COVID-19. Could you explain what that means?
So there will be a portfolio for every single country in the world, except Iran, Syria, and Lebanon, because they are considered enemy state that is forbidden to trade with. But for every other single country in the world, a security portfolio will be created that will outline countries' security needs. And the tender clearly articulates that in the post-COVID reality, countries will be experiencing economic crises. Economic crises will lead to people's popular resistance, and countries will need the technology to be able to control this post-COVID-19 moment of crisis. So this portfolio analyzes the country's security needs, specifically what will it need to be able to control their rebellious populations and to manage their rebellious populations. So this is a far-reaching portfolio of oppression, and it's not surprising that Israeli companies, in a sense, are capitalizing on this moment in the form of bolstering repression on a global scale.
The corporate race for natural resources has already put millions of people around the world at risk of abuse, especially indigenous communities. Some transnational corporations involved in industries such as mining, agribusiness, and energy production are responsible for land grabs and environmental damage on a large scale. People seeking to protect their land and environment face growing levels of violence and intimidation. This is the voice of a Guatemalan land rights activist.
Cerca de las 11 a 10:30 aproximadamente, cuando llegaron un grupo de personas desconocidos, yo salí a ver qué pasa. Directamente me atacaron a una bala en la cabeza.
Women who challenge the activities of corporations are particularly vulnerable to harassment and sexual violence. Since the beginning of the pandemic, the difficulties faced by these brave women and men have increased. Mandatory lockdowns have severely limited their ability to carry out their work and have made them even more vulnerable to attack. The COVID crisis has enormously damaged businesses around the world. But while many responsible businesses have suffered, some private companies with questionable human rights records have used the crisis to speed up their activities. A recent report by a number of NGOs highlights how mining companies pushed for governments to declare the industry an essential service. In doing so, they have become key vectors for the spread of the virus and are putting rural and indigenous communities at great risk. The report also highlights how the crisis is being used to secure regulatory change that favours the industry at the expense of people and planet.
Some corporations are continuing business as usual while communities are in lockdown. And so we have heard reports of licenses being granted or businesses continuing to operate where there is severe community resistance, and they're using the opportunity of the lockdown on communities to continue without that resistance.
Siobhan Curran is Trócaira's advisor on human rights and democratic space.
So really these developments should be halted while COVID-19 is still an issue in countries. And I suppose more broadly, we would be concerned that the recession that we are facing will be used as an excuse to lower human rights and environmental standards. And for example, some of our partners in Myanmar have raised concern that the new economic plan, which will fast track particular types of investment and projects, could be used to fast track projects that are not compliant with human rights and the environment. So that fear is there that rather than strengthening our human rights and environmental protections, which we need to do, that they may actually be eroded in the face of a looming recession.
Siobhan, you mentioned fear about a lowering of environmental standards. So why is defence of the environment so important, particularly in the context of public health?
The work of environmental land and Indigenous defenders is so important because they're protecting their communities, but they're also protecting communal resources which benefit us globally. We have partners that we work with that are protecting rivers, they're protecting the ecosystems in which they live, they're protecting biodiversity by trying to stop the large tracts of lands being taken over by corporations, for example, for palm oil production or for sugarcane. And in doing that, in protecting our environment and protecting our biodiversity, they are actually buffering us against future pandemics. What's very interesting is to hear the research from the World Health Organization, from international experts on food systems, and they would be very clear that as we erode our biodiversity through, for example, industrial agriculture, through the misuse of land or through environmental degradation, we are leaving ourselves very vulnerable to future pandemics.
Throughout the pandemic, there's been lots of talk about going back to normal. The virus has turned many people's lives upside down. The idea of returning to the way things were gives us a sense of hope. However, when we interrogate this normality through the lens of human rights, what do we see? We see an already sick world, a world of gross inequality where the most vulnerable people were struggling to survive in the face of poverty and oppression. We see a planet on its knees because of environmental destruction. Is this a normality which we are prepared to return to? Not surprisingly, powerful forces have exploited a period of crisis to further their own agendas. Maybe there's something to learn from that. Surely this global crisis also presents an opportunity to further a different agenda. A recovery based on human rights and compassion for the most vulnerable.
We need legally binding mechanisms for corporations to oblige them to meet their responsibilities in relation to the environment and human rights. I think it's also important to think about, as we build back better, the type of businesses that we want to support. And certainly it should be conditional on any business who's going to receive support from public money to build back their business, that they should commit to human rights and environmental standards. And we need to be sure, as we build back better, that we aren't starting to build back in a way that just promotes business as usual and that ignores the voices of communities who are experiencing human rights violations.
International corporations are deeply complicit in Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory, in the direct violations of Palestinian rights. And this, in a way, is part of the logic of corporations. The logic of corporations is maximizing profit, and profit is the main drive of corporations on a global scale. So the question is when are you stopped? In kind of when are you forced to put an end to that logic? And that's a question for us here. It's a question for us to deal in the context of Palestine, but it's a question on a global scale.
Whether it's challenging the actions of oppressive governments or tackling human rights abuse and environmental damage by big business, now is a crucial time to act towards a more just and sustainable world. Each of us can play a part in building back better.
I think you have to choose civilization every day. It has to be an active choice. It doesn't come by itself. We have choice to improve civilization, to work for human rights, individually or as part of a group. But we have a choice and we can choose it.